cowboy rescued a wounded giant Apache, and the return at dawn unveiled a truth tied to his name. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack Thompson was a cowboy by trade, but by choice, he was a man of solitude. For years, he had chosen the quiet of the wilderness over the noise of the world. He had a small ranch on the outskirts of the valley, far from the bustling towns and the chaos of society. His home was modest, a wooden cabin surrounded by miles of open land, and his days were spent caring for his cattle, repairing fences, and maintaining the land. It wasn't that Jack was unfriendly, it was just that he found peace in isolation. The people in the nearby town didn't understand him, and frankly, he didn't care. There were no friends here, no real connection, just him and the vast landscape. But that peace was about to be shattered. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack heard a faint cry carried by the wind. It was a sound he wasn't used to hearing out here, a human voice, desperate and weak. Instinctively, he grabbed his rifle and moved toward the source of the sound, his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he approached the clearing, he saw her. A woman, collapsed on the ground, her clothes torn, and blood staining the dirt around her. She was an Apache, no doubt about it, her dark, weathered face, her long black hair, and the faint markings on her skin told him everything he needed to know. Jack hesitated for a moment. He had lived a long life with little to do with the native tribes of this land. They had their ways, and he had his. But something about this woman's plight stirred a feeling in him he hadn't experienced in years. Without thinking twice, Jack rushed to her side. He could see she was badly wounded, the blood from a deep gash on her leg soaking into the earth. Jack's hands worked quickly as he tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and wrapped it around her wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to stop the bleeding for now. As he worked, the woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing a piercing gaze that locked onto him. Her breathing was shallow, and her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "You saved me," she said, her words heavy with disbelief. Jack said nothing at first. He had no words to offer, just the quiet assurance that he was there. After a moment, she tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. Jack helped her, his hands steady but cautious. She seemed to study him, her eyes scanning his face, as if trying to understand why he was helping her. Finally, she spoke again. "I owe you," she said simply. Jack shrugged. "I didn't do it for thanks." She nodded, though Jack could see the gratitude in her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "Jack," he replied, his voice rough from the dryness in the air. "Jack Thompson." "I'm Ayana," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Ayana of the Apache." With that, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them. Jack had saved her life, but neither of them knew what the future held. As the night wore on, Jack helped her into his cabin, where she would rest and recover from her injuries. But little did he know, this moment of kindness would be the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, a sound in the distance caught Jack's attention. He stepped outside, squinting into the morning haze. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. A procession of Apache riders, 200 strong, making their way toward his ranch. The warriors were silent, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe. They were coming for him, but Jack had no idea why. Ayana had made her return. And with it, a truth about Jack's past, a truth tied to his name, was about to be unveiled. The riders came into view, their horses moving in perfect synchronization, a sea of warriors dressed in traditional Apache gear, their faces painted with intricate designs. Jack stood at the edge of his porch, his heart racing as they approached. The air was still, almost too still, the only sound the soft thud of hooves against the dusty ground. He had never seen so many Apache warriors gathered in one place, and the sight sent a shiver down his spine. His eyes searched for Ayanna, but she was nowhere in sight. He could only wonder what this visit meant. As the riders drew closer, they slowed, forming a circle around his ranch, their presence overwhelming. Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the leader of the group. The leader was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a long braid and piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through him. He was an imposing figure, his stature almost as commanding as the warriors around him. The man dismounted with a grace that belied his size, his eyes locked onto Jack's. "You are Jack Thompson," the leader said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of authority. Jack nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I am." The leader studied him for a moment, then motioned to the riders. "We have come because of Ayanna." Jack's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her name. "She is recovering inside," Jack replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. The leader nodded, then stepped closer to Jack, his gaze unwavering. "Ayanna is a woman of great power among our people," he said. "She has returned to honor a promise made long ago." Jack furrowed his brow, confusion settling in. "A promise?" he repeated, his mind racing. The leader's eyes softened, though there was a weight to his words. "Yes," he said. "A promise tied to you, Jack Thompson." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Jack's mind spun. What promise? What connection did Ayanna have with him? The leader placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his grip firm. "It is time you learned the truth about your family, Jack. A truth that has been hidden for many years." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the realization began to settle in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The leader turned to the warriors, signaling them to dismount and form a respectful line. "Come with me, Jack," the leader said. "Ayanna has waited for this moment. She has waited to return and fulfill the promise made to your family." Jack followed the leader, his legs heavy, his mind racing. He didn't know what to expect, but something told him that this day would change everything. They walked toward the center of the ranch, where Ayanna stood, her presence commanding and serene. Her eyes met Jack's, and for a moment neither spoke. It was as though time had stopped. She was no longer the wounded woman he had found in the desert. She was a leader, a chief of her people. She stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with the weight of history. "Jack," she said softly, her gaze never leaving his. "The truth I carry is one tied to your bloodline. You have the strength of your ancestors within you." Jack's breath caught in his throat as Ayanna's words echoed in his mind. "My ancestors?" he repeated, the question thick in his throat. Ayanna nodded slowly, the truth in her eyes undeniable. "Yes," she said. "Your family has been tied to mine for generations. And it is time for you to know what that means." The circle of warriors behind her remained silent, their presence unwavering as they watched the exchange between Jack and Ayanna. Jack's mind raced as he tried to process the gravity of her words. He had always known there was something more to his past, something he had never fully understood. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Ayanna stepped closer, her voice steady. "The promise made to your family was one of protection, of unity. It was a bond forged long before either of us was born. And now, it is time for you to honor it." Jack stood there, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth that had just been revealed to him. The truth about his family, about his connection to the Apache people, was far more complicated than he had ever known. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch, Jack knew that everything in his life was about to change. I can see the confusion in Jack's eyes. But Ayanna's calm presence remains unwavering. The sun has begun to climb higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the valley as the Apache warriors stand in respectful silence. Jack looks at Ayanna, his mind racing with 1,000 questions, none of which he can bring himself to ask just yet. Her words, heavy with the weight of history, linger in the air. He knows she's telling him something important, something that ties him to a past he never understood. His family. The promise. The bond. The protection. Jack's heart beats faster, the weight of it all settling on him. "What do you mean by the promise?" he finally asks, his voice rough from the tension in his chest. Ayana's gaze softens, and she steps forward, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable authority. "Your family, Jack, was never just a family of ranchers. Long ago, your ancestors and mine formed an alliance. We were bound by blood and honor, though you were never told. You have carried the weight of that promise without knowing it, but now it is time for you to take your place in that history." Jack's mind spins, trying to piece together the words. A rancher's family bound by a promise to the Apache? It sounds like something from a dream, a story passed down by the firelight. But as Ayana stands before him, her eyes filled with both determination and something softer, perhaps regret, he realizes she isn't lying. She believes every word she speaks. "I never knew any of this," Jack murmurs. "How could I?" Ayana nods, her expression thoughtful. "Your family chose to forget. They chose the life of a rancher, of isolation, rather than the life of the protector they once were. But that choice has come with consequences." Jack feels a chill run through him, the weight of her words sinking in. "Consequences?" he repeats. Ayana steps back slightly, looking toward the horizon. "The promise was not just for protection. It was a bond of duty. A duty that has been left unfulfilled for generations. Your family's absence from that responsibility has not gone unnoticed." Jack's chest tightens. He's beginning to understand, but it's more than he can handle. His ancestors made a promise to the Apache, and now, because of their abandonment, it seems that burden falls on him. "So what does this mean for me?" Jack asks, struggling to find the right words. Ayana turns back to face him, her eyes intense. "It means you have a choice. You can refuse, as your family did. Or you can embrace your duty, as they once did. The choice is yours, Jack." Jack's thoughts race. What does he know of duty? He's spent his life avoiding it, choosing solitude over responsibility. But as he stands here now, with Ayana's piercing gaze on him, he feels a stirring deep within him. The pull of something greater than himself. Something he can't ignore. The wind picks up, and for a moment, the silence is broken only by the sound of the warriors adjusting their gear and the distant calls of birds. Jack looks down at the ground, his thoughts swirling. Finally, he looks up at Ayana, his face set in determination. "I'll honor the promise," he says, the words feeling strange but right on his tongue. Ayana's expression softens, and a small, approving nod follows. "Then we will walk this path together, Jack Thompson." Jack swallows, feeling the weight of what he's just said. His life has changed forever. His past, which once seemed like a distant memory, now feels very real, and the future holds a path he never expected. But as Ayana stands before him, surrounded by her warriors, he feels the gravity of the choice he has just made. This is no longer just about him. It is about something much larger. And as dawn breaks over the land, a new chapter begins, not just for Jack, but for the Apache people as well. The morning air was cool, the sun still rising over the distant mountains, casting a golden hue over the land. Jack Thompson stood at the edge of his ranch, his mind heavy with the words Ayana had spoken. He had accepted the promise, the duty, but what did it truly mean? He looked out at the vast expanse of land he had called home for so many years, now feeling as if it belonged to something much larger than him. Ayana and her warriors had set up camp just outside his property, and though the warriors were silent, their presence was unmistakable. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if something was about to unfold. Jack walked slowly towards the camp, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. The warriors watched him, their faces unreadable, but Jack felt their eyes on him, weighing him, assessing him. As he approached Ayana, she stood alone, her gaze steady and unwavering. She looked different now, not just the woman he had helped, but a leader, a chief. You've made your choice, she said, her voice carrying the authority that only years of leadership could bring. Jack nodded, his throat tight. I have. Good, she said, her expression softening just slightly. The path ahead will not be easy, but it is the right path. Jack swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. What do we do now? Iana motioned for him to follow her. Now we begin the journey, she said, turning and walking toward the gathering of warriors. Jack followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what was ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was part of something much larger than himself. As they reached the center of the camp, Iana raised her hand, signaling for silence. The warriors immediately fell quiet, their attention focused on her. She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and respect. This is your family's legacy, Jack, she said, her voice carrying across the camp. The Apache people have waited for this moment. For you to take your place. The promise made long ago is not just a piece of history. It is alive, and it lives in you. Jack stood tall, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He was being asked to carry the mantle of his ancestors, to protect and honor a promise made long before he was born. Iana continued, her voice strong. You will walk with us, Jack, as an equal. The time of isolation is over. You are one of us now. Jack felt a strange mix of pride and fear. He had chosen this path, but now that it was real, the reality of it was settling in. He was not just a rancher anymore. He was part of a tribe, part of a people, and his role was more important than he could have ever imagined. What do we do first? Jack asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. Iana smiled, her expression both fierce and proud. First, we begin the journey to the land where your ancestors walked. It is time to reclaim what was lost. Jack nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He was ready. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this was where he was meant to be. As Iana turned to address the warriors, Jack felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. The weight of the promise of duty was heavy, but it was a weight he was now willing to bear. The warriors began to prepare, gathering their horses and supplies, and Jack found himself at the center of it all. This was his new life. The life of an Apache protector. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, he knew his destiny had just begun. The journey was long and the landscape vast. Jack Thompson had never ventured far from his ranch, but now, with Iana and her warriors by his side, he found himself traveling deeper into Apache territory. The land stretched out before him, wild and untamed, just as he imagined it had been for centuries. The air smelled of pine and earth, a sharp contrast to the dry, open plains he knew so well. As the days passed, Jack grew accustomed to the rhythm of the group, Iana leading with quiet strength, the warriors riding in formation, and Jack following behind, learning the ways of a people he had once only heard about in passing. Every so often Iana would stop to give instructions to the warriors, her voice calm but filled with authority. Jack had begun to understand the depth of her leadership. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a leader of her people, someone they trusted to guide them through the trials ahead. At night they would camp under the stars, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the stillness of the wilderness. Jack sat with the warriors, trying to blend in, though he still felt like an outsider. Iana would often sit with him, her presence a quiet comfort as they watched the fire dance in the night air. One evening, as the fire burned low and the stars shone brightly above, Jack asked, "How did this all begin? The promise, I mean." Iana glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "It began long before either of us was born," she said, her voice steady. "Your ancestors helped my people during a time of great need. They saved us from a fate many of us still remember, and in return, a promise was made. Your family would protect the Apache, just as we would protect them." Jack leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in concentration. But why was it kept a secret? Why didn't anyone tell me? Iana looked down at the fire for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Sometimes the past is buried because it's easier to forget. Your family chose to live as ranchers, to distance themselves from the promise. But the bond between us was never broken. It's always been there, waiting for the right time. Jack nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. He had never thought of his family as anything more than simple ranchers. But now he realized they had been part of something much larger, something far more significant than he had ever known. The journey continued for days, the landscape shifting from rocky hills to thick forests, and Jack felt himself growing more connected to the land. He began to understand why the Apache held it so dear. It wasn't just the land itself, it was the history, the legacy that was tied to every tree, every stone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of travel, they reached a place that seemed to pulse with ancient energy. It was a clearing, surrounded by towering trees, their trunks thick with age. In the center stood a large stone, worn smooth by time. Ayanna stopped her horse, and Jack followed suit, his heart racing with anticipation. "This is where it began," Ayanna said, her voice quiet but filled with reverence. "This is where your ancestors made the promise." Jack dismounted, his feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. He stood before the stone, feeling a deep sense of connection to the place, to the history that had been hidden from him for so long. The warriors dismounted as well, standing in a respectful circle around the stone. Ayanna stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the stone's surface. "This is where the bond was forged," she said. "This is where the promise was made, and where it will be honored." Jack stood beside her, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch the stone. He felt the weight of history in the touch, the responsibility that had been passed down through generations. For the first time, he felt as though he truly belonged, as though he was part of something much larger than himself. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and Jack closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the moment to wash over him. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. As the warriors gathered around him, Jack knew this was only the beginning. The promise would be honored, and he would walk this path with Ayanna and her people, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days that followed were filled with long hours of travel and quiet reflection. Jack had made his choice, but the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders as they journeyed deeper into Apache territory. He had agreed to honor the promise made by his ancestors, but he was still unsure of what it truly meant. As they moved through the wilderness, the landscape shifted again, this time to a rocky ridge overlooking a deep canyon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sage, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed through the valley. Ayanna led the group with her usual calm and purpose, her presence commanding the respect of every warrior around her. Jack followed, his mind racing with questions, but he kept them to himself. There was no use in asking now, he had to learn the way of things, just as his ancestors had. As they made camp that night, Jack sat near the fire, watching the flames dance. The warriors were scattered around the camp, some sharpening their weapons, others speaking in low voices. Ayanna sat across from Jack, her gaze fixed on the fire. After a long silence, she spoke. "You are ready for what comes next, Jack," she said, her voice steady and calm. Jack looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "I never asked for any of this." Ayanna's expression softened. "None of us ask for the burdens we carry," she said. "But you have the strength to carry this one." Jack didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if he believed her, but he appreciated her words. They were meant to reassure him, and for the first time since he had agreed to the promise, he felt a small spark of hope. The fire crackled between them, the warmth a contrast to the cool night air. Jack thought about the stone they had found, the place where his ancestors had made the promise. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but in reality, it had been only days. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming, something that would test him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The warriors had finished their tasks and now sat in a loose circle around the fire. Jack noticed the way they moved, with a sense of quiet strength, their eyes ever watchful. They weren't just warriors, they were guardians of something much larger than themselves. And now, Jack was part of that. Ayana stood up, signaling for Jack to follow. "Tomorrow, we will reach the land where the promise must be fulfilled," she said, her voice low. "The time for questions is over. What matters now is action." Jack nodded and stood up, his body stiff from the long ride. He followed Ayana as she walked toward the edge of the camp, where the trees parted to reveal the canyon below. The moonlight cast long shadows across the landscape, and for a moment, Jack felt as though he was standing on the edge of something vast, something he could not fully comprehend. "This land is sacred," Ayana said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is where our people have lived for generations. It is where your family's promise must be honored." Jack looked out over the canyon, the silence of the night pressing in around them. He felt the weight of her words, the history that lay in the land beneath his feet. It was more than just soil and rock, it was the foundation of a people, a bond that stretched across time. "How do I fulfill this promise?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ayana turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "By standing with us, Jack. By walking the path of those who came before you. The promise is not just about words. It is about action, about protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Jack looked out at the canyon again, the moonlight reflecting off the water below. He knew that what lay ahead would not be easy, but he was ready. He had made his choice. The promise was his now, just as it had been for his ancestors. And as he stood beside Ayana, looking out over the land, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The journey had only just begun. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jack Thompson felt the weight of the promise settling deeper into his bones. The air was still and cool, the kind of morning that felt both serene and heavy with anticipation. Ayana's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Today, they would reach the land where the promise must be fulfilled. Jack stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the vast landscape before him. The canyon stretched out below, its edges lined with the trees and rocks that had stood for centuries. This was the land of his ancestors, the land that now called him to fulfill a duty he never knew existed until recently. He felt both the excitement and the burden of it all, the sense that he was walking in the footsteps of those who had come before him. Ayana appeared beside him, her presence calm and steady. She said nothing at first, simply looking out at the land with the same reverence Jack now felt. After a moment, she spoke. "This is the place," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of history. "This is where the promise began, and where it must be honored." Jack nodded, feeling a deep connection to the land, though it was still so unfamiliar to him. He had spent his life as a rancher, working the land he had known, but this was different. This was something sacred, something that transcended his understanding. Ayana led the way as they made their way down the rocky path toward the valley below. Jack followed, his steps sure but tentative. The warriors moved in quiet formation behind them, their eyes scanning the surroundings, ever alert, ever watchful. As they reached the bottom of the canyon, the atmosphere changed. The air was warmer here, and the land felt more alive, the rustling of leaves and the sound of water flowing in the distance creating a sense of peace. But Jack could feel the weight of the moment growing heavier with every step. They came to a clearing where a large stone stood, its surface worn smooth by time. Jack paused as Ayana stopped in front of it. "This is where the promise was made," she said, her voice low. "Reverent." Jack stepped forward, feeling the pull of the stone beneath his fingers. It was cool to the touch, the ancient markings etched into its surface telling a story he could not yet fully comprehend. But as his fingers traced the surface, he felt a surge of something deep within him, a sense of connection to his ancestors that was almost overwhelming. Ayana stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the stone. "Your family's promise to my people," she said quietly, "was not just a word. It was a bond, a duty. A duty to protect, to honor, and to fight when necessary. Your ancestors chose to step away from that duty, but now you must decide whether you will step into it." Jack swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had never thought of himself as a protector, never imagined his family's legacy was anything more than that of simple ranchers. But here, in this sacred place, it felt as though something was awakening inside him, something that had been dormant for generations. "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. Iona nodded, her expression unreadable. "The choice is yours, Jack," she said. "But know this, the land remembers. The promise remains." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had made the decision to walk this path, but the reality of it was heavier than he had expected. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a part of something much larger, something that had been set in motion long before he was born. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the canyon, Jack stood there, his hands still resting on the stone, and for the first time, he felt as though he was part of something much larger than himself. The promise was his now, and with it came a responsibility he could not ignore. Jack Thompson had made his choice. And as the warriors gathered around him, ready to continue the journey, Jack knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges. But he also knew that it was a path he was meant to walk. The promise had been passed down through the generations, and now it was his turn to honor it. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Jack had made his choice, but now? He had to understand the weight of it, to walk the path set before him with the responsibility that came with it. Iona led the way, her presence a steady force, as she guided Jack and the warriors through the rugged terrain. Each step they took brought them deeper into the land of the Apache, a land that was not only sacred but also marked with the history of Jack's ancestors. As they traveled, Jack began to understand that this journey was more than just about fulfilling a promise. It was about reclaiming a legacy, one that had been lost for generations. The warriors moved with ease, their bodies and minds in sync with the land. They were not just traveling, they were connected to it, their every step part of something much larger than themselves. Jack, still new to this way of life, followed closely behind Iona, his mind racing with questions. He had always thought of himself as a simple rancher, someone who worked the land and kept to himself. But now, as he walked through the valley, surrounded by the warriors, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man of the land, he was part of a story that stretched back generations. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Iona stopped and turned to face Jack. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet but filled with purpose, "we will reach the place where your ancestors made their stand. It is where the promise must be fulfilled." Jack nodded, his throat tight. He had heard the stories, but this was different. This was no longer a distant memory, it was real, and he was about to be a part of it. That night, as the warriors prepared camp, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling of the wood was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Iona sat beside him, her presence comforting yet powerful. She had said little in the days since their journey began, but Jack could feel her strength, the quiet authority she carried. "What will happen when we reach the place?" Jack asked, his voice low. Iona glanced at him, her eyes dark with thought. "It will depend on you, Jack," she said simply. "Your ancestors made a choice, and now it is your turn to honor that choice. The land remembers, and so do the people." Jack's heart raced. The land remembered? What did that mean? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much larger than he could fully comprehend. The night passed in a quiet reverie, the stars overhead twinkling like distant promises. As Jack lay on his bedroll, he thought about the stone, the place where his ancestors had made their vow. He had touched it with his own hands, feeling the weight of it, feeling the connection to something ancient. It was as if the stone itself had spoken to him, urging him forward, urging him to fulfill the promise that had been made so long ago. The next day, they continued their journey, the land shifting beneath their feet. The terrain grew more rugged, the path steeper, but Jack kept his eyes forward, focused on the task ahead. By midday, they reached a ridge, and Jack could see the valley below. In the distance, at the base of the mountains, there was a clearing, a place that seemed untouched by time. Iona stopped and motioned for the warriors to gather. "This is it," she said, her voice strong. "The place where the promise must be fulfilled." Jack stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the gravity of the moment. This was it, the point of no return. As he approached the clearing, he saw the stone at the center of the area, much like the one he had touched days ago. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, a presence that was both ancient and alive. Iona stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the stone. The promise was made here, she said softly. And now, it is your turn to honor it. Jack looked at the stone, his hand reaching out as if guided by some unseen force. He placed his palm on its surface, feeling the coolness of the rock beneath his fingers. For a moment, everything was still. The wind had stopped, the warriors silent around him. And then, in that stillness, Jack felt something shift inside him. It was as though the weight of the promise was no longer a burden but a responsibility he was meant to carry. The air around him seemed to thicken, and Jack knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of something that would change. Not only his life but the future of his people. The promise had been passed down through generations, and now it was his to fulfill. As Jack stood before the stone, his hand resting on its cool surface, a profound stillness washed over him. The warriors around him were silent, as if waiting for something, waiting for him to do what was needed. For a moment, Jack felt lost in the weight of it all. The air was thick with the history of his ancestors, the promise they had made, and the duty that had now fallen on his shoulders. Iona stood beside him, watching him closely, her presence a steady anchor amidst the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. Jack had spent so many years thinking of himself as just a simple rancher, a man who worked the land. But now, here in this sacred place, he realized he was part of something far larger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just honoring the past, he was shaping the future. As his fingers traced the markings on the stone, a surge of energy seemed to flow through him. It was as if the land itself was awakening, calling him to step forward, to take his place in the long line of those who had come before him. The promise was no longer a burden but a responsibility he was ready to carry. Iona spoke, her voice low but clear. "The land remembers," she said. "It remembers the promise. And now, so must you." Jack nodded, his breath steadying as he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This was his moment. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was the only path that mattered now. The warriors stood patiently, waiting for their leader to act, for Jack to take his first step into the role he had been called to. Jack felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. The past, the present, and the future all seemed to converge in this one moment. He wasn't just standing on the land, he was part of it. Iona stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was a quiet intensity in it. Jack took a deep breath and looked around at the warriors. Their eyes were filled with respect, but also with something deeper, an unspoken understanding that he had to prove himself. "I'm ready," Jack said, his voice steady and firm. Iona smiled slightly, and then, with a graceful motion, she gestured toward the horizon. "Then let us begin," she said. And with that, the warriors mounted their horses, their movements fluid and practiced, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Jack followed Iona, feeling the weight of the stone's legacy in his chest. As they rode, the landscape changed once again, the terrain becoming more rugged, the air heavier with the scent of pine and earth. Jack could feel the land growing more alive around him, as if it was watching, waiting. The journey ahead was unknown, but Jack knew this was his place now. He had chosen to honor the promise, and in doing so, he had chosen a new life. A life that connected him to his ancestors, to Iona, and to the Apache people. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the canyon below. Jack looked ahead, the path stretching out before him, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose. The promise had been passed down through generations, and now it was his turn to fulfill it. He was no longer just Jack Thompson, the rancher. He was part of something greater, something that would last long after he was gone. And as they continued their journey, Jack knew that the land, the people, and the promise would always be with him.